Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and a fountain pen enthusiast who uses them to make art. And in this video, we'll be reviewing this pen, the Majohn P140, from an artist's perspective. We'll look at the pen in detail, take it through my usual series of tests, draw with it extensively, and decide whether it belongs in your pen arsenal. And since the best way to talk about a pen is to compare it to another pen, we're going to see how it fares against its very similar compatriot, the Majohn P141. Let's get started. Some time ago, I made a video where I reviewed three large pens, the Majohn P141, the Junline 930, and the Asfine V800. That review was relatively well received, but several fountain pen nerds snarkily mentioned that the Majohn P140 was the far superior pen, sparking my curiosity. Well, proving once again that it doesn't take much to convince me to buy yet another fountain pen, here is the Majohn P140 in the clear demonstrator finish. This is yet another Montblanc 149 clone. Here it is next to an actual Montblanc 149. In terms of dimensions, capped, it is 15 centimeters long. Uncapped, 13.3 centimeters. And posted, it extends to 17 centimeters. The weight of the pen when capped is about 37.8 grams when fully filled with ink. And without the cap, 26.5 grams. A substantial weight, but nothing terribly heavy for a pen this size. Like the Montblanc 149, the pen has a short, gently tapered grip section, which is not my favorite, but serviceable, especially since the cap threads are relatively smooth and don't irritate the fingers. Furthermore, the barrel, despite being girthy, is uniform in thickness, allowing you to grip the pen farther back for those longer strokes. The pen does post securely, but because of its length, becomes slightly back heavy, so this is not a pen that I would probably use comfortably posted. The pen is a piston filler, which holds about 1.7 milliliters of ink, not particularly impressive considering that a standard long international cartridge holds 1.5 milliliters. The brass parts operate very smoothly and can unscrew with one of those little wrenches which is not provided, but is easily available from a number of Chinese manufacturers. The nib is a number 8 size that has recently become very popular with a large number of pens coming out of China. The nib unit unscrews easily, and the nib and feed pull right out without much effort. Great news for those of you that are looking for a pen that's easy to clean. One unusual feature here is that this pen uses an ebonite feed, as opposed to the plastic feeds usually used in a majority of pens, Chinese or not. For those unfamiliar with ebonite, this is a form of hard, vulcanized rubber, which was the preferred material for making feeds in the past. Why is an ebonite feed considered such a big deal? First, because it's not common, usually found on higher-end pens. And second, it's widely considered to be a superior material to make feeds from, because of its flexibility and absorbency, resulting usually in a more generous ink flow. Let's run the pen through our series of tests and see how it performs. As always, I'm working on Strathmore 300 series Bristol paper with a smooth surface. The pen is filled with my usual Noodler's Lexington Gray, a transparent ink that lets us better see the ink flow in the pen. In the consistency test, the pen puts down a consistent line at every speed and every direction. Majohn has made terrific strides in the quality control of their nibs and deserve tremendous credit. A few years ago, I would buy a Majohn pen and switch out the nib as soon as I got it, without even trying the nib. Now their nibs perform about as well as the high-quality nibs made by the major German nib manufacturers. In the flex test, this nib has a surprising degree of flex to it, going from a fine all the way to a triple broad with ease. In reverse writing, it struggled a bit, however, putting down a scratchy, extra fine line that quickly dried up, which is unfortunate. So in the flex test, I would give this pen a 5.5, perhaps even a 6, putting it into deep semi-flex territory. However, this is by no means a flex pen in the traditional sense. A true flex pen should quickly snap back to normal writing, allowing you precise control over line width like this. This pen takes its time returning back to normal. So yes, you can get very nice line variation from this pen, but don't expect perfect calligraphic control. In the feedback test, this pen was quite smooth, gliding like a figure skater effortlessly across the page. I actually prefer a little more feedback from my nibs, but for some, the smoothness will be a delight. And in the wetness test, the pen under normal line is moderately wet, but with any kind of line variation becomes super juicy, something we'll have to discuss later. And now let's perform the ultimate test and see how this pen works in a drawing. For the drawing, I'm staying with Noodler's Lexington Gray ink, but switching over to my Talen's Art Creation sketchbook, which is filled with a smooth, off-white multimedia paper. The first thing I noticed was that the line width on this paper was considerably thicker than it was on Bristol paper. This is likely due to 3 factors. 1, this paper is slightly softer and more absorbent than the Bristol. 2, because we're working in a sketchbook, the soft layer of papers underneath the drawing allows the nib to dig more into the surface. And third, and most relevant factor, the wetness of the ink flow. Your results will vary since you might be using a different paper, different ink, and have a different touch. But for the way I work, this pen puts down a line that's just too wet and wide. The bouncy line variation was welcome, and I think I managed to get the most out of it. But I had to be very careful with the wetness of the lines and tried my best to keep the layers of hatching to a minimum. The result was a drawing that was bolder and more graphic than my usual style, tempered slightly by the fact that I'm using a transparent gray ink, which adds a touch of softness. And while I was overall satisfied with the final drawing, too many stylistic concessions had to be made to deal with the wetness and broadness of the pen. That, combined with its relative ineffectiveness in reverse writing, make it less than ideal as a drawing instrument. Again, at least for my relatively precise, layered drawing style. Here is the final drawing. Now that we looked at the P140 in detail, let's answer the question of how it compares to the P141 model. These pens are almost equal in dimensions, with the P140 being about a millimeter longer. The P140 is also 4 grams heavier than the P141 because the piston mechanism in the 140 is made of brass, whereas in the P141 it's made of plastic. Other differences are also slight. The opaque models of the P141 have a Mont Blanc-like slotted ink window, whereas the opaque models of the P140 have a clear ink window. The main difference here is that the P141 uses a slotted proprietary nib and a plastic feed. I've already reviewed this pen in detail, but for comparison's sake, let's quickly run through the tests. In the consistency test, we see that it performs just as well as the P140. In the flex, it's not as flexible, but because it starts off with a much finer line, the line variation is still noticeable. In the feedback department, the pen has moderate feedback, nothing unpleasant. And in the wetness test, we see that it's much, much drier. In short, the main difference between the 140 and the 141 is that the 140 has a much more generous ink flow, which contributes to a much wetter, broader line and smoother feedback. Whether ebonite is actually a superior material to plastic for making feeds is a topic I'll have to make a video on in the future. But here is an important point. One of the advantages of ebonite is its ability to be heat set. This involves heating the feed in very hot water and pressing it tightly against the nib, allowing the feed to perfectly conform to the contours on the inside of the nib. My suspicion is that with heat setting, the ink flow in this pen could be moderated slightly. However, due to the width of the ink channel, which on ebonite feeds is almost always wider, the pen would still write far wetter than the 141. So to conclude, while many pen reviewers judge the P140 to be the superior pen, I think it really depends on your preference of writing wetness. Wetter pens tend to be smoother and more pleasant in writing, but in art making they can cause problems, creating lines that are too thick and wet for delicate detail, creating ink puddles when you're trying to put down dense hatching or texture. For many purposes, a dry writing pen like the P141 is actually preferable to the P140. So while in terms of build quality, I would probably lean towards the 140 for its brass piston mechanism, the pen you choose really depends on your drawing style and your preference for wetness. For bold, juicy lines on high-quality, non-feathering paper, go with the P140. For sharper, drier, more precise line work on a variety of paper types, go with the P141. Actually, I would get both, since these pens really do different things, and both have excellent ergonomics and build quality, and both are deserving of a place in your drawing arsenal. I hope you enjoyed this review of the Majohn P140 and the comparison with the P141, and if you did, please hit subscribe and enjoy my other fountain pen related content. Thanks so much for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.